So we're going to look at individual differences here, and I'm going to focus specifically on personality. I know individual differences can mean many things. The other thing it tends to mean quite often is differences in intelligence, but I'm not going to bother with talking about intelligence because I think the stuff on personality is kind of more interesting and is supported by quite a lot of evidence from non-human animals as well. To try and explain the problem of individual differences, and particular individual differences in personality with respect to evolution, just go over a few things that I'm sure you're aware of. One of the things about personality is that twin studies by people such as Robert Plomin and various other people, many studies have shown that personality, so things like extroversion, neuroticism, and so on, are partly heritable, depending on what particular trait you're talking about and the nature of the study you're talking about. And I'll be saying more about that particular factor later on. Traits are somewhere between 30 and 50% heritable, and what that means is that somewhere, if you look at the range of variation in personality, so if you get a large sample to fill out the big five, extroversion, openness to experience, etc. questionnaire, then you find that people vary. Some people are more extrovert than others, some people are more open to experiences than others, some people are more neurotic than others, and so on. And if we want to try and account for that variation, so why are some people higher than others, then what twin and adoption studies show is that genes seem to account for about 50% of that variation across people. So that's essentially what personality trait heritability means. What it doesn't mean is that, if you like, 50% of any one individual's personality is from their genes and the other 50% is from the environment. That would be a misreading of the data, and it's wrong to make that assumption. In other words, if you imagine, let's say, that height is 90% heritable, I don't know if that is indeed the case, but it'd be something like that because height is quite heritable. It doesn't mean that 90% of your height, let's say, is from your genes and the other 10% is from the environment. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that, if you're 6 foot tall, then 5'8" of you is from your genes and the other remaining 4 inches is from the environment. Anyway, so this is about variation across people. Intelligence is higher than that. So the question there is, we might make an assumption that there is one best phenotype, there is one best way of designing an animal. This is kind of what sometimes evolutionary theory seems to say, that there's one best design of an animal for a particular environment. So if that's the case, then why aren't we all the same in terms of our personalities? Is there some adaptive benefit for us being different? Or is it just some kind of noise or randomness or whatever? So that's one of the questions. Why is there variation? So maybe this assumption that there is one best designed animal for a particular environment is wrong, and maybe there are multiple different versions, multiple phenotypes, each of which has its own level of success. Or it could be the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, it could just be some kind of noise, that just some people happen to be better than others, and somehow those less fit individuals are kept in the population. But then the question is why? Why hasn't natural selection tended to eradicate those less effective phenotypes, simply because those individuals don't survive and reproduce as well as the better designed animals? So this is our conundrum. The other thing is that if we do indeed say, okay, yeah, maybe there are different phenotypes, there's not one best way, one best strategy for playing a game of life, and we can think of personalities simply as being different strategies of success, then the next question is, well, then why is it only partially heritable? Why aren't these personalities completely wired into us? Why is there this variation which is accounted for by the environment? And if you think about if you say personality traits are 30 to 50% heritable, then that means that they're 70 to 50% due to the environment. Okay, so to try and explain this, basically one account is that it just doesn't matter. The individual differences don't matter. They have no effect on survival and reproduction. They're just kind of invisible to natural selection. They're just noise. So we kind of say that there's no point. There's no adaptive benefit. Natural selection just isn't able to select because they're not. There's no overall benefit to survival and reproduction. The second possibility is that they do make a difference. There are certain that some personalities may be more successful in certain environments, but there may be reasons for those different strategies, those different kinds of personalities being effective. So they're not noise, they're not invisible, but there is somehow they're being kept in a population. So this is a bit abstract, so let's go through some of these ideas. But first, what I want to do before I do that is to raise some issues about heritability, which I think is important if we are to understand heritability properly. Heritability comes from a discipline called behavioural genetics. So behavioural genetics and behavioural geneticists are basically the people who do twin studies and adoption studies. They're trying to estimate the amount of variation in a trait which is down to genes and the environment. It's kind of complicated, it's kind of mathematical, but let's look at some of the issues associated with this particular discipline. Turkheimer is a behavioural geneticist, and he has what he calls Turkheimer's law, where he says everything is heritable. Pretty much any trait you can measure somebody on. If you do the kind of correct twin and adoption studies, you will find that identical twins are more similar in that particular trait than non-identical twins. Remember, identical twins are genetically identical, they're essentially clones. Identical twins were the result of a single fertilized egg, which would ordinarily produce one individual, which, following fertilization, divides, and we have two individuals. So basically, identical twins are two people from one. Non-identical twins, on the other hand, are the result of two eggs being fertilized by individual sperms, or two sperm, two eggs, just like siblings. So they share 50% of their genes. Identical twins share 100% of their genes. And what we find is that identical twins are always more similar on whatever trait you want to do, on average, than non-identical twins. So that, not just extroversion, not just intelligence, not just neuroticism, not just optimism, but many, many things like, mental illnesses and political views. So this paper is showing that identical twins reared apart have more similarity in their political views and their voting behaviour than do non-identical twins reared apart. And this is crazy. You think, well, political views are simply a new thing. There was no real function for Democrats versus Republicans, presumably, on the African savannah. Donald Trump wasn't around them, so there was no one to vote for. Jeremy Corbyn wasn't around them. So how could political views be heritable? How could it be? And their explanation is, well, political views are to a certain extent, not completely, but to a certain extent, an extension of your personality. And research tends to show that if you're a compassionate kind of person who tends to value inclusiveness and individual autonomy, you tend to be generally a kind of have socialist kind of views. Whereas if you're somebody who values kind of self-reliance and hierarchy, you tend to have more conservative or Republican style political views. So everything is heritable. But it's important to understand what heritability means, and here are a few wrinkles. This is a thought experiment which was originally by Richard Lewontin, and this is nicely explained by the philosopher Ned Block in a very interesting paper, the link is here, called How Heritability Misleads About Race, and he's basically addressing the race and IQ argument and trying to show how it's misconceived. But Lewontin's argument is that we imagine we go out and get some seeds from the garden centre. These are just normal seeds. They're not clones of each other. They're just normal seeds that you might get from taking the seeds off a plant or something like that. We give the seed bag a shake, and we divide them randomly into two piles. Okay, so there's no bias about how you're sorting these seeds. Both of them you put into these planters here, and you give them all lovely uniform lighting. But in one of them you give them deficient nutrients, and the other one you give them normal nutrients. So you don't give them the right amount of fertilizer here. So what we might wish to ask here is, why are some of these plants bigger than others? That might be a perfectly normal question if you're somebody who's trying to develop seeds for farmers to increase their crop yield. We want to know what's causing these. The answer to that question is rather strange, because it depends on which comparison you make. Now, if we want to say, why is this plant towards the right here and the right hand planter bigger than this plant here to the left of it, this one's bigger than this, then the answer has to be, well, these are all in the same environment. So the difference here has to be the fact that the genes for this plant are somehow leading that plant to be bigger than the genes that this plant has, because remember, these are all genetically different. They're not clones of each other. And similarly, if we want to know why this plant here is bigger than this plant here, then again the answer is because the genes for this plant it's got, if you like, genes for tallness, whereas this has got fewer genes for tallness or genes for shortness, whatever. And remember, we have to say that is because the environment is constant. There's no variation in the environment between the plants in this group or this group, so any differences have to be from the environment. Sources of variation either come from genes or the environment. If it's not genes, it must be the environment. Okay, that's the reasoning. Okay, but if we're interested in why on average these plants are taller than these plants here, then the answer has to be, well, there's no net variation no net difference in the genes here overall, because we randomly selected a bunch of seeds, so there should be no net genetic differences. So the answer is why these are bigger than these is entirely due to the environment, that these have got a good environment and these have got a bad environment. So it's a kind of strange question. The answer to the question depends on what you say. Let's take this back to psychology. Imagine these aren't plants but are kids. Imagine instead of talking about height, we're talking about educational achievement, and rather than these being planters, they're actually schools. So we've got two schools here, a good school and a less good school. So the good school is on the left and the less good school is on the right. So if we go to a good school and say, well, why is this kid achieving better than this kid? Then the answer would be, well, it's not the environment, because the environment's the same. So this kid is doing well, and the kid on the left is doing well here, and the kid to our right is not doing less well because of genes, because the environment's the same. Okay, I know we might say the family environment too, but it's a thought experiment. The environment's the same, and why this kid is doing better than this kid on the right here is because genes, because the environment's the same. So a study which just looked at one school or even a couple of schools and compared each individual within that school to other individuals in the school could well come up with the conclusion that there's no point in teaching kids, because all variation in educational achievement is entirely down to genetics. So let's not bother improving schools. We can't do anything about it. On the other hand, if you do a different study and ask the question, well, why are kids in this left-hand school here doing better than kids in a right-hand school here, then the answer is very different. The answer is that these kids in the good school are doing well because they have a better environment. Why this is important to remember is, and I'll say a little bit more about this in the next screencast, why this is important is that in terms of critical thinking and critical evaluation, people will pull the wool over your eyes and present you with data which seems to show that there is either no effect of the environment or there is no effect of genes. But quite often that is due to the fact that they're comparing either within an environment, in which case you get a greater preponderance of genetic variation, in other words, genes explain differences more, or on the other hand, you're comparing between two different environments, in which case genes don't seem to matter and environment seems to be the most important thing. So either one of those is not true. It's not, because what you've got to do is look at both different comparisons within group and between group variation, and that'll give you a better idea of exactly what's going on and how much genes are influencing IQ. And I will say more about this in the next screencast.